Hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Here we are again for another wonderful evening's installment of How Are Things Really? And our guest this evening, or along with a great deal of invisible work, our guest is Ibn Arabi. Now, Ibn Arabi is an unusual sort of literary presence. Ibn Arabi has contributed to world literature in the guise of a theologian, of a philosopher, of a mystic, of a Sufi, of a poet, of an exemplary recorder and worker with of consciousness, and has given to us a great deal of creative ideas, which have played a variety of roles in the evolution of consciousness as the years and decades have gone on. And we're just going to look a moment here and now at what the great collective mind makes available to us under the aegis of the work of Ibn Arabi. Well, you could say it starts off in Islamic Spain in about 1165, and in late July or early August is when Ibn Arabi is born, Muhammad ibn Arabi. And like so many of the ones who have given us so much, he was originally his family forebearers went back, much like Ibn Khaldun, whom I spoke of earlier, all the way back into Yemen and Arabia, and along the way the various Berber tribes amalgamated into the ones who became the inhabitants of this early times of the Islamic Empire, which eventually became part of Spain when the Roman Empire receded, and there was this great rebirth of various forms of vernacular speech and vernacular culture. And for a time in Spain, there was a great blending of Christian and Jewish and Islamic cultures, and a great many principalities and powers sometimes working together and coexisting in harmony, and other times, in great rivalries of power, which had, great displacements of peoples across vast geographies, from Spain, southern Spain, Andalusia, and across the strait there, the Strait of Gibraltar, into the Maghreb, into northern Africa, and then farther east into Eastern Asia, places like Cairo, Damascus, Mecca, and all these other places. And so in a certain sense, we are, evoking a geography of a distant time, and a very distant time to us. And also a very, there's a great deal of, emotional or psychological or cognitive dissonance between the subject matter of Ibn Arabi and how he expressed himself, and the ways we understand such matters now, just as a people, as a generality, in general terms, because it's like medieval mysticism. It's medieval Arabic mysticism, which is what I'm kind of like, calling up here. And there are many in our modern times or postmodern times or postmodern times or whatever you want to call them, where such a thing is just very, very alien. And I am not here to persuade anyone that it's an interesting field of study. Instead, I am here to invite interested people into like a space, an imaginative space, which we share, a literary space, where we can begin to study some of the subject matter that did inspire Ibn Arabi, and show just some of the connections that it might have to our present day concerns as individuals, as individuals who are questing on our own for a deeper sense of truth. I mean, a deeper sense of truth more and differently than can be offered to the modern psychological ego, which is, you could say this is one way that we are conceiving of ourselves in the most general terms, and so then, what I'm doing is inviting you here into a realm of thought where such terms and words and names will be deployed as to suggest a totally different way of looking at things, perhaps. And then again, the psyche is ever creative from one moment to the next. It's almost like I could actually say to you that the psyche is more different than it was one moment from the way it was 1 moment ago than the way it was 1,000 years ago, or the way it might be 1,000 years from now, because we are dealing with a different sense of time. We are dealing with a different sense of what constitutes contemporaneity. And in this way, understanding this, recognizing this, acknowledging this, then we begin to become more akin to the spirit of Ibn Arabi and the spirit of his work and the spirit of his thoughts as well. So it's kind of like that. And yet it takes place, at least in external time and space terms, in a world of principalities and powers in conflict with each other, and military powers, administrative powers, politics of all kinds are taking place. And Ibn Arabi, his father, was employed in some kind of military and or political capacity to a certain principality, but that soon changed shortly after they came to Spain, to Murcia specifically, to Murcia in Andalusia in Spain, about 1160 or 1165, when Ibn Khaldun was born. Then there was a change of rulership, a change of powers, and Ibn Khaldun's father began to work in some political administrative function to this new regime, which was sort of local, I think, around in Andalusia. And it was in this context then that young Ibn Arabi first became aware of the world. And as he puts it in some of his voluminous writings, by the way, which some say that there's like 800 books that he wrote, and some say, well, it's more like 200, and others say, well, it's somewhere in between those two, but a great many have been lost. A great many, objectively, this is verifiable, have not been translated. A great many of his works still remain in his own hand, so it is said. And at the same time, there are great, large, voluminous works which have had a massive and rich influence, in the mystical current, even up to this day. Anyway, but when he was a child, he was into, it took a while for him to put away the things of a child. At first he was into military things, horses and swords and encampments and all of these kind of things. And this is the world that he was in, and perhaps even a career that he was expected to follow. But it is inscrutable now when we begin to try to formulate for ourselves an understanding of the growth of a saint or a spiritual presence. It is inscrutable to delineate certain turning points and even try to objectively describe some of the epiphanies that led to the young Ibn Arabi putting away the things of a child and becoming the one that he was to become. But we can refer to some of his writings. And so he speaks of going to the mosque one day along with another, I think it was an elder to him, of the ruling peoples, and seeing this individual and watching the individual at prayer in the mosque, and sensing something in the gestures and in the words and in the feeling of the act, the human being in this devotional kind of context. And for Ibn Arabi, in some of the accounts that he later said, this was the beginning of his beginning to see through the eye and not with the eye, as William Blake would put it. So from there, it seems that there was this part of the formation of his personality was someone uniquely gifted with this faculty of vision. That is what we would call it now. We might also call it maybe just an acute awareness of the contents of his consciousness as it unfolded to him in the world of the formal thoughts in his experience and in the cultural context of the religion in which he was raised. And so this provided him the terms by which to speak of the things that he underwent in his consciousness and the things that he saw in the most comprehensive sense of the word. Anyway, so at some point in his teenage years, he took to living apart from the people, living in a cemetery, living in a hut in the cemetery, performing devotions and awaiting the visions that would come, and at the same time attending to the world of dreams, and more and more his destiny and his identity became revealed to him in these kind of forms, in dreams and visions, and certain kinds of inspired thoughts, and certain kinds of states of mind set apart from the conventional understanding of human experience. And this was in a time and place where there was a little bit more openness to that and a little bit more of a recognition of something like this that might be happening in an individual, such as Ibn Arabi. It was also happening in such that there was a philosophical flowering, a legal blossoming. There was a scientific birth happening also at various times. And some of the people that we are still known today, associated with it, were around when Ibn Arabi was a teenager. And there we begin to get a picture of some of his character, what we might imagine to be the character of Ibn Arabi. For example, the great philosopher Averroes, also known as Ibn Rushd, the Aristotelian and the Aristotelian interpreter and translator, who was such a nourishing presence in the thought of Thomas Aquinas, some years later, along with some of the other Arab Aristotelians. And these were speculative philosophers, and by speculative I mean that they were deeply disciplined according to the rational tradition, the rational culture, and the rational way of seeing. But by speculative, that means they were trying to see, using these kind of processes of reasoning, to see where such a process of reasoning would take them into the understanding of the ultimate forms, such as God and the universe. And they were committed, people like Averroes were committed to that as a philosophical way. In this way, they were very much akin to the Western philosophers of Plato and Aristotle and all those who come after and all those who came before. And but at some point there was an encounter between the established philosopher Averroes and this rough-hewn teenager Ibn Arabi. They had some kind of meeting, and Ibn Arabi must have had his reputation already kind of operative, because Averroes was eager to greet him, eager to meet him. And for a moment, the story goes, according to what Ibn Arabi later related, they stood together, and Averroes greeted the younger one, Ibn Arabi, very, very warmly. They clasped hands. They stood apart for a moment. And you can imagine how it might be, two intuitives kind of standing together and sharing a certain world of thought. And according to the story, Averroes, as they stood apart, for a moment, Averroes said, "Yes." And Ibn Arabi said, "Yes." And Averroes beamed. He was so glad they could both say yes, in mutual affirmation of a certain kind of internal reality. "Yes," said Averroes. "Yes," said Ibn Arabi. And then, a moment later, though, Ibn Arabi said, "No." And Averroes became very, very concerned and distressed even. And there was a few more moments of silence, but, much was happening within the minds of both. And it was then, only then, that Averroes said something to elaborate this mysterious exchange of yes and no. Averroes said, "So I am distressed, young one. Is it not true that speculative thought is confirmed by the reality of individual vision? I, Averroes, the worker in the fields of speculative thought, am I to believe that you, Ibn Arabi, a visionary, is it not so that our mutual conceptions of reality kind of reinforce and reaffirm each other? That's what I take your yes to be. Oh, but then your yes is followed by a no, and I am sore distressed by this. What could the no mean?" And then Ibn Arabi, we might think of a very self-confident youth, or we might think of one who is so absorbed in their own inspiration that conforming to the social niceties is just kind of secondary to them, and yet they will still communicate warmly and honestly. And, well, Ibn Arabi said, yes, up to a point, speculative thought and the visionary experience of an individual bolster and conform and reinforce and nourish each other. And then there comes a point when they do not. But, as the work of Ibn Arabi later is to prove to us in so many ways, it is the country between yes and no that shall concern us. And as Ibn Arabi said in that moment, in that dialogue, Ibn Arabi said, between the yes and the no, spirits take flight, and heads are detached from bodies. Between yes and no, right? So this is like an introductory kind of like suggestive anecdote about the field of thought that we're talking about, and the field of understanding. Yes, it is in many ways, in literary terms, in religious terms, in some degree cultural terms, it is tightly determined and tightly bound together, one thought to another, in the thought streams of both the thoughts of someone like Averroes as well as someone like Ibn Arabi. And yet, from the inside, it is utterly unique to itself. And that's how we could approach it, so as to step aside some of the, pitfalls and vortexes that might, and the complexes that are out there that we could step in as we try to understand for ourselves the nature of God and the universe and things such as this. This is what I believe Ibn Arabi was saying. Spirits take flight, and heads are detached from bodies between yes and no, because it is between existence and non-existence that is our field of interest, between belief and non-belief, between God and the creation of God. In between all of these things is where the visionary thoughts begin to take their form, just like in an ecosystem of the mind, in an ecosystem of the imagination. They have the ways that they are taken in all of us, in our individual soils, in our individual climate conditions. And yet at the same time, Each of these forms of thought, each of these thoughts, have a certain inevitable process that they go through in terms of our own experience, and only in terms of our own experience. And it's we come to it, all of us, through many, many misdirections and much miseducation that I'm sure that we are in our own way aware of and coming to become more aware of. And then we come to these places where we can try to express some of these thoughts occasioned, by Ibn Arabi. And so, here we are doing that. And so in that sense, then I would say to you, there is a field, or a climate of thought, just like there is a field and a climate of atmosphere and of weather, just like there are zones of characteristic habitation that, are clear to us through our senses, and yet are also clear to us, in other ways as well. It is just how we live, how we come to interpret the world to ourselves. And to accommodate that, to account for that, and this is why we have these traditions of imaginative folklore and mythology, and to account for all these kind of intangible atmospheric qualities that attend to the growth and formation of the thought and the thinker and our understanding as thinkers of these thoughts. So we have access to that in ways to help us to understand, to help illuminate us, but not so much to condition us in the ways that so often can seem that that's what is happening externally, when we're just looking at things conventionally. But when we break through to the creative level of things, then we're coming at it from the inside. And heads are detached from bodies and spirits take flight, but also certain things are seen at certain times and in certain places. So in the atmosphere, then, among the sensitive ones in Andalusia at that time, there were strange, people had inklings about certain things. And there was one named Jafar who was born and raised in Lisbon. And he had some interior summons to find the teacher of the age. Now, this term, the teacher of the age, was this something that his own, intellectual ego formulated, or was it something that was more sacred than that or more mysterious than that? But I guess he was going to find out. He was going to find out. And so what did he do to find out who is the teacher of the age? He traveled. He traveled east. He traveled east from Lisbon all the way to Mecca. And at Mecca, perhaps around the coming close perhaps to the Kaaba, to the Black Stone, or maybe kind of on the outer edges of it, he saw a figure, a mysterious figure clothed in green. This mysterious figure is an established mystery in the lore of this kind of poetic thought. This figure clothed in green who comes at the right time in the right place and says the right thing, or gives the right direction, or perhaps gives the right misdirection that is misunderstood in just the right way. When the right person does the wrong thing works in the right way. And there are certain facilitators of that. And this figure clothed in green, he appeared before Jafar in Mecca and said to him, as if he knew his innermost thoughts, which he no doubt did. So, you have come to seek the teacher of the age. But let me tell you, you have come east and you have come to the wrong place. The one that you seek is back in the west, back from where you came. Go back to from where you came, and I will tell you more. This mysterious green-clothed figure said, this one that you seek, the teacher of the age, is named Muhammad Ibn Arabi, and he is the child of such and such a family, the family of Tai. And actually, this is another thing. Ibn Arabi's family was descended from the great Hatim Tai, who has a great body of folk stories told about him and poetry. Hatim Tai was known as a ruler and as a great, the most consummate acts of generosity and magnanimity have gone down in history, mythological history, poetic history, as those performed by Hatim Tai. One of his descendants is Ibn Arabi. And this mysterious green-clothed figure, shall I say his name now? I've said so many names, unusual names. This was Khadir. Khadir, the green-clothed figure who appears at mysterious times in between the lineaments of time and space. Again and again, a mysterious carrier of inspiration. Khadir, Khadir. He corresponds to Elijah in Jewish folklore. You know, this mysterious rescuer, this mysterious beneficial presence. Anyway, he offered to Jafar the information of who the teacher of the age was, said him by name, and go back to the west from whence you came, said Khadir, and seek him there. And then Khadir said something more. There is something wrong in your seeking. You seek the teacher of the age. He is where you came from. Go and find him there. And there is something wrong in your seeking. And then just as mysteriously as he appeared, Khadir vanished. Well, Jafar had heard what he needed to hear in that place and in that time, so back he came. Back to Lisbon, where he asked around, and he'd heard, yes, there was someone by that name, Muhammad ibn Arabi. He was in Lisbon, Jafar, at the same time that you left. But you left now, and you've come back to Lisbon, but he's no longer in Lisbon now. He's somewhere to the east, not as far east as Mecca, but seek him in Seville. So it was about, the latter part of 1260s, 1270s, perhaps, when walking down the streets of Seville, following and asking around, he met someone who fit that name, Muhammad ibn Arabi, walking away from school with some books under his arm. Oh, but he was a mere child. And Jafar came up to him and said, "Are you Ibn Arabi?" "Yes, I am," answered the lad. "Are you the teacher of the age?" And the lad said, "I need time to answer that question." And at that moment, Jafar decided that this was a child who says he needs time. He's not really telling me what I want to hear. So Jafar said, "Oh, then I have no need of thee." And Jafar turned and went away and did not see Ibn Arabi till some 30 years later. It was in Aleppo that he entered a vast hall, and there was Ibn Arabi, who had attained to a degree of external prominence, as the teacher of the age. Jafar walked into the place where Ibn Arabi, now as an adult, was an esteemed teacher. And Ibn Arabi saw him in the doorway and said to him, the question that you had 30 years ago doesn't need to be answered now. And the green one said to you that there was something wrong in your seeking. Well, Jafar, what that was it was a matter of the time and the place. The time and the place working together. Oh, so this was an eye-opening statement that Jafar heard. And he became one of the foremost disciples of Ibn Arabi in the course of his life. So it's a matter of timing. This is what it seems to say. And I believe that this is something that we can step back and consider for just a moment. All of these ideas and all of these themes and all these images and all of these vignettes and things, they all are in their own trajectory, in imaginative time and space. And they are taking a certain form right now in my in my words and in your ears as they take place. And from there, they will continue to take form throughout the universe, you might say, through time and space. It's a matter of timing, you see, when we catch hold of these things, when we catch a glimpse of these things. But we are witnessing something that is moving to a greater degree than our external minds, really our customary minds, are used to understanding. So this brings us then to something we must say about Ibn Arabi as a poet, I guess you might say. Um, I frequently refer to William Blake because William Blake's work, represents to me, so many different layers of understanding. Um, but one of the layers of understanding of the work, the corpus of work of such a worker as William Blake, um, brings to mind, in my mind, is the tradition or the stream of time out of which these manifestations, these works where thoughts are made known, where they manifest in kind of a stream of time, what preceded them? What comes after them? I think of William Blake then, and I think of his predecessors, such as Milton, such as the Hebrew prophets and things. Well, with Ibn Arabi, we can also see, a monumental and elemental kind of primordial, magnanimous thinker. But what we see as a predecessor of his, of course, we're back to the Quran. We're back to that singular book, which is a book unlike no other book. And in that sense, then, we can see, we can just kind of like say kind of quickly that the thought of Ibn Arabi externally conforms to the tradition or the many traditions around the Quran and the Hadith. And many of the concepts, are not, innovated or changed by Ibn Arabi, but they are just, they just take shape and form in the background of a unique and gifted consciousness. And so it's not like the ideas and the thoughts, it's not like by taking hold of them, Ibn Arabi has changed them from what they are. And it is not by Ibn Arabi having these thoughts and formulating them, drawing them from the air around him, the culture around him, the books around him, and then bequeathing them on in these other forms. It is not as if they have changed in their original nature, either coming in or abiding or going out. I don't think these thoughts of this nature, they don't actually do that. They seem like they do, but that's just part of the glamour, the glimmer, the glittering, but the true light is something of a different dimension of existence. Anyway, let's just talk for a moment then about the kalb, K-A-L-B. This is the Quranic word for the heart, the kalb. It is the lens, the place where the spirit and the soul meet, where the mind, you might say, which we would probably kind of like, we have limited our contemporary understanding of the mind to mean the brain, the brain, the nervous relay station, the brain, the nervous relay station, processing physical sensual impressions, as well as other thoughts, this field of electrical activity. Well, okay, fine, but I think when we begin to look at the kalb as a conceptual reality, we can come closer to understanding something that would help us to understand certain poetic concepts. The kalb, the heart. Nowadays we think, it's, Valentine's Day was just the other day, right? We might think of the heart as being the locus of affection and sentiment. And surely it is this. And it is, Quranically speaking, also the kalb. It's the seat of intention. Intention and will and emotion and value. And it is the place where these things are kind of like held and formed and pondered, the kalb. But the very word itself also means change. And in Arabic, the roots of the words, the meaning of the roots of the words share this kind of like very fertile and common ground where they can kind of nourish each other in a way where we can like have a lot of objective approaches to these seemingly subjective phenomena, such as experience and sentiment and feeling and thought and all of this. But anyway, what I want to say is the kalb is this field of constant change in oh so many ways, impressions and thoughts and concepts. It is like, this is why so often Ibn Arabi and others use the metaphor of a mirror. And what can we say about a mirror? A mirror, well, in a certain sense, the qalb, the heart, is like a mirror. It contains and reflects these many, many vast changes. I mean, the mirror contains all change and is a changing thing when you speak of it in terms of its product, which is the reflections, the constant change of the reflections that the mirror reflects. And yet, the mirror in and of itself, in its nature as a mirror, is a mirror. And yet, in its own nature also, it reflects that which actually is, and it reflects it in such a way that it seems to be, to the eye, to the human eye, the sensual human eye, as well as the spiritual human eye, and all these things, then they too are mirrors within themselves. And so this is how we can understand sort of like the qalb, is this place, this mirror where we see the creations of the original. And what is the original? Well, the original has many names. And what is many, many words? And what are words to some are names to others. And what is the word to some is the name to others. And so the origin of the universe, the origin, the maker, who within the self of this maker, this is where we begin to talk about like the one God. And is it possible, it would free us so much in our understanding of not only religious phenomena, but, all sorts of phenomena and even our own experience, if we could just turn a certain mirror on the wall, if we could just turn it toward the wall, turn the mirror toward the wall so that the mirror just reflects the wall, and look at the back of the mirror, and what will you see? You might see black density. But I'm talking about like the mirror of exoteric, of external kind of realities that beguile us and take us away and have done such and misguide us so much in the areas of our ultimate concern. Well, we're always given ways to cope with that and to deal with that, to dispel that kind of spell. And that what that is, that's the poetry, and that's the literature, and that's the body of literature that Ibn Arabi helped to create. Anyway, the qalb. And this is just a little bit of, because when Ibn Arabi speaks of the imagination, well, it behooves us then to consider the notion of the qalb, as we understand it, the notion of the mirror, the notion of the manifold changeability of all that the mirror reflects, and the notion of the one who makes the reflections, and the essential unknowability of that one. This is the philosophical area where we can get into like kind of this Ibn Khaldun kind of like mode of understanding. But we can also look at the life of this individual. Because this is also something, this is true with Buddha, this is true with Muhammad, and this is true in so many ways where we have in the phenomena of the human individual, we have the personality, as the personality presents itself to us, which follows its own trajectory. All of us are that. I'm speaking of all of us individually. And yet there is this other aspect to it, the presence of the personalities, I mean, for example, with Buddha, there's Shakyamuni Buddha, there's Gautama, Siddhartha, the prince at that time who left his princely surroundings and meditated in such a creative way that his consciousness and the work of his life was to formulate this great body of teachings, which nourish us to this day. That's the biographical kind of Buddha. But then there's the presence of the Buddha, which is represented in some of the artworks. There's the medicine Buddha, there's Tara, there's white Tara, there's green Tara, there is Chenrizeg, there is Avalokiteshvara, and all of these other kind of like manifestations of the being of the Buddha. There's the Buddha as the presence. And then there is the personality, individual Buddha with the, in the context of the, the parentheses of time and space. It is that way with Muhammad. And there is the Nuri Muhammad. There's the light of Muhammad. The quality of presence of Muhammad is not, according to these mythological teachings, these religious and spiritual teachings, is not just contained in the actual biographical figure of Muhammad. It extends into all these other realms that are only touched upon imaginally, in the imaginal realms. So part of Ibn Arabi's work, actually, which is one of the reasons why he's so massive, was to actually bring into a more tangible form an entire body of literature, Sufi literature. We can say this. In my previous talk on Ibn Khaldun, I referred to it several times to Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali was a great classically trained philosopher, Aristotelian, and much like Averroes in a similar way, and whose contribution is similar in its vastness. Al-Ghazali came to Sufism later on in his life, and his work as a rational and thorough philosophical thinker was to reconcile Islamic orthodoxy with Sufism, which was kind of like this wild inner body of strange teachings, which seemed to not be contained by any kind of orthodox religious formulation. Al-Ghazali showed in a systematic way that it can be, these things can be made into kind of a unified cultural whole. Ibn Arabi's work was somewhat different because Ibn Arabi was steeped in Sufism from early in his life. And the way that Sufism is expressed from the time when around Muhammad were people so deeply concerned and so deeply interested and so deeply devoted to the inner realities of life and the spirit as they were taking form around them at that time, that they had all these ways of maintaining that awareness in their hearts and in their minds, remembrance, practices, forms of dialogue, ways of prayer, ways of expression, ways of conveying to each other, forms of courtesy, an entire way of life, a varied and spontaneous kind of way of life. Well, it can be said, that before Ibn Arabi, it hadn't been brought over into actual writing in the same way that Ibn Arabi did it, in the same kind of large-scale, massive way. He kind of bequeathed out of his gift of learning and language an entire corpus of literature, a body of literature gathered from these spontaneous kind of practices and ways of life, and formulated them into literature, which is itself a changeable thing. Literary form, poetry or treatise, or riddle, or just, whatever you want to say, prose, paragraph. These are changeable forms. And what is also a changeable form? Thought and experience. This too is a changeable form. And part of what gives Ibn Arabi his fascination, and also all of this literature its fascination, is all these words and thoughts have various and polyvalent kind of manifestations in the ways that they are understood inwardly and outwardly, and in the course of time as they are studied and accepted and or rejected, down through the course of history. This is part of the mix and the ferment of cultures, But it's not limited to just that, of course. It's not just limited to cultural forms and manifestations. There's something much more elusive also that is happening, and that's happening within individuals, and that's happening, as we look into the true mirror, of the rain puddle, which ripples with every passing wind and makes of one shape and one face many faces and many shapes. What can contain this mystery? Does the word contain this mystery? Well, the word is a mystery of its own, is it not? These are the fields, the rich and tricky fields. The rich and tricky fields where Ibn Arabi works. Well, yes, so Ibn Arabi was deeply steeped in Sufism. And it was kind of, it seems, It was a wilder tradition out west, i.e. in Spain and stuff, than it was in the East. It was more formalized in the East. But Ibn Arabi's early life was spent among those who were much less externally educated than himself. His Sufi teachers, even though he was gifted in a way that was perhaps at times abrasive, with this inner certainty of the truth of his own visions. It was also true that he understood, that what God does all at once, to a soul, pulls it out of its context in time and space in the course of ordinary maturation, and places all these mysteries before it. And then, the Spirit moves in mysterious ways. And then the individual, so gifted with such a vision, has to return to normal things, right? First the ecstasy, then the laundry, as they say. And the individual must walk a path over which before they had flown in the blink of an eye. Now they must walk that path in the course of their lives with its moments and its seasons and its nights and days. And so Ibn Arabi, as a youngster, was tutored by these Sufis who, there was Fatima, who was like 95 when she taught young Ibn Arabi. And how did Ibn Arabi serve her as a student? How did he learn from her? He constructed her a hut of sticks. You see, Fatima, she depended for her sustenance on what strangers gave her. And if strangers did not fill her hand with food, she did not eat. And she lived outdoors. And with his own hands, Ibn Arabi, this gifted scholar, he stepped down to learn from a deeper source, and was taught by Fatima as he made her a hut of sticks, as he put it, which was no higher than she was tall, And there were others like that too. And there were other manifestations of Khadir. And he saw in those teachers something that his vast intellectual gifts had not provided for him. He saw pure servants of the invisible one. And he saw, creative thought, but not manifested in a literary form, but manifested as a way of being, expressed moment to moment in a very humble way by these people who are invisible to what we normally see as the meritocracy of cultural contributors. But Ibn Arabi knew better than that. And so, as time went on, he drew on his early days among the unlettered Sufis in Andalusia as he went on in his life and in the trajectory of his own career, which did involve, more kind of like external eminence for whatever reason, the mysteries of fate. But certain ideas were to be expressed in that way, in that context. We are still working with that even now, asking ourselves what all these things mean. It's so vast. It's so difficult but to sum up just a little bit of it. Anyway, circumstances, though, in his adult life, he had to leave Andalusia, and he would go to places like Tunis, Tunisia, Fez, Morocco, and other places in the Maghreb, and he would come back sometimes when he could, but eventually, after about 1200, he left for good. Because I think of certain things that were happening in Dar es Islam, in the greater Islamic world, with the conflicts with Western and Northern Europe, and in the East, Genghis Khan and everything that meant. It was a time of just great change, anyway, sometimes people had to take to the roads, for survival's sake. That might have been part of what was going on with Ibn Arabi. Sometimes he had to leave town because of local clerical reputation, accusations. Sometimes he had to, as is often the case, in all of the world's religions. Creative thought kicks up all different kinds of reactions, and sometimes, accusations of heresy and other kind of things can cause one to have to choose, what time, when to blend away into their midst and escape before they throw you off a cliff, or, this is part of the life trajectory of Ibn Arabi as well. And yet at the same time, we can say this, because I know that, I can't say everything that I want to say, in this immediate time and space. But let's just say this, though. Let's say this about Ibn Arabi as an individual, within the time and space parentheses. Um, we see him as someone who's so absorbed, in the intensity that just, comes to them out of whole cloth in such a way that they can utterly flummox a figure like Averroes, with a mere yes and a mere no. But we can also say that at the same time, this is an individual who, bowed down and stooped, to learn from those who did not have what we would call his great gifts, but who learned deeper things of the ultimate things that which he was, deeply interested in. And all these kind of influences, he brought together in a creative way again and again in all these different books that he wrote in all these different places. And how can I give you a flavor or an inkling of that? I can put it this way. We have kind of just loosely suggested that Ibn Arabi brought into being a new form of literature by bringing from, the oral traditions that were around him and his own visions, bringing them over into classical Arabic writing, on the page. But there's another level where where that is happening also, and that is when Ibn Arabi is speaking to the people who have an interest in him, a similar kind of mutual interest in the nature of the unseen world. And part of his skill as a teacher, part of anyone's skill as a teacher, and it's very much a part of the ethos, of any kind of body of spiritual teaching in the world's religions. There is an art. There is a courtesy, there's an adab, but in the art of teaching, one, speaks to people according to their own needs, speaks to people on the level of their own experience. And Ibn Arabi would often say things like, what is it that a teacher must be? Must he be learned? Must he be gifted? Must he be visionary? Must he be all of these things? Well, here's what he really must be. Say all those things if you want to, but the teacher must have what the student needs. The teacher must have what the student needs. He was taught by teachers who had what he needed, and he in turn served in that way. And it took him a while to learn that, I would think, as I imagine what his character was like. But in terms of speaking to people in the way to which they're accustomed, and in terms of their own needs, when this is done, one could understand it perhaps in a kind of like a dry, condescending way. Oh, speak to them on their level of development. But actually, it could also mean, Lord, make it intimate. Make what is intimate to you, intimate to others by doing what? Finding the common language. We all share the same world. We all breathe the same air. Even though we use these words differently, we all share the same 26-letter alphabet here. And in that sense, we can grow intimate with these common forms of expression and allow them to warm and blend with those ideas that have inspired us in more mysterious ways, so as to bring into local cultures, local times and places. As Khadir told Jafar, there needs to be timing. It's an element of timing, and that's mysterious, right? It moves in mysterious ways. But anyway, Ibn Arabi exemplified in a way totally unique to himself the response to the need to speak to people in their own terms, to make it intimate to them, and to contribute to the vernacular literature and the vernacular body of mythical lore, by speaking to them in those intimate terms. Someone said to him once, later on, this is perhaps when he was in Mosul. He ended up in Damascus, and that's where he spent the last his old age. And it was a very creative old age. He wrote many, many books in Damascus. Once he was in Damascus, his traveling days were behind him. And so perhaps it was in Damascus. He was careful in his teachings, though, so as not to get arrested. He would have different circles of students for different kind of subject matters, So, because what was so extremely esoteric is best not said in a loud voice for a great many reasons, And at any rate, though, it was also, the common touch was also there. It would have to be that way. really. And so someone once said to him, El Ghazali, I don't see you teaching philosophy. I see you with people. There, you are always there. You are around people. You entertain them. You take them on trips. You feed them. You converse with them. But where is the teaching? Where is the philosophy? And Ibn Arabi would say, well, let's talk about it in terms of the analogy. The teaching is by analogy. In response to the need to connect with people spiritually at the most intimate and common level, there is this form behind the forms, which is analogy. And so to illustrate this, Ibn Arabi, it is said this, told a story. Ibn Arabi said, yeah, it's kind of like there was once an individual who was in great distress because he had a treasure and he buried it in the ground at the foot of a certain tree. Oh, but one day he went to, look at his treasure, to check on it, and he saw that it had been dug up. There was a hole in the ground there at the roots of this tree, and he was so upset. And so he went to the local sage and said to the local sage, I have a treasure I buried in a particular place, and now it is dug up. Oh, will I ever see it again? Oh, can you help me to recover it? And the sage said, give me a few days, and I will see what I can do, see what I can see what I can find out. And the sage called a meeting. The sage called a meeting of all the local physicians. And the sage said, have any of you physicians written up a certain prescription involving the root of a certain tree? He asked. And among the physicians, there was one who had. And the sage said, could I have a private word with you? And so the sage had a private word with this physician who had recently prescribed the roots of a certain tree. And the story doesn't tell us exactly what transpired between the sage and the physician, but it, as you might surmise, it was that physician who, while digging at the roots of a certain tree to gather roots to make the medicine for the prescription for his patient, to satisfy that patient's individual needs, had serendipitously discovered this treasure. And, finders keepers, so they say. And the physician kind of like, he scooped it up. And the sage said, I know who that treasure belongs to. We don't need to say any more about it, but I need to get it back to that individual. And so some days later, the distressed individual had their treasure restored to them by this basis, by this action, by this skillful means. And Ibn Arabi said this story, and he said, this is what I mean by analogy. And that's what he offered in response perhaps to the unspoken question one might have, well, then what do you mean by analogy? Well, he told this story. And so we see, different worlds kind of like blending together. We're talking about like the in-between parts of the world. I want to offer one other thought about this, and I know that the time flies by on wings made of many feathers. But so I want to offer this to you, and perhaps, I can only suggest just this little bit. Let me read something to you from our individual. He wrote a lot of poetry, and whenever critics or accusers said that this is just commonplace, this is vulgar, this is erotic, this is like, love poetry. Well, a lot of love poetry traditionally, and this is true in all religious traditions, is speaking of an original kind of love, But that's not always apparent to the literal minded, and sometimes the reactions are extreme. Anyway, Ibn Arabi had a strange encounter at the Kaaba with two individuals. One of them spoke to him completely in enigmatic signs. That was the one who speaks in a voice that is not sound. And then there was the other encounter with the daughter of a local pilgrim, Nijam. That name means harmony. And he wrote this poem about her in which he introduces this concept. In the commentary, I think. He wrote the commentary to it as a response to some of the critics. And I think of like St. John of the Cross in his Dark Night of the Soul poems and his extensive commentary. I think of Dante and all the things he wrote about Beatrice. Anyway, but here's just an idea that I want to just throw out there gently. As Ibn Arabi says, and among the wondrous things is a veiled gazelle, a divine subtlety, veiled by a state of the self, referring to the states of those who know. A veiled gazelle, a divine subtlety, veiled by a state of the self, unable to explain their perceptions to anyone, or to others. They can only indicate them to whoever has started to feel something similar. It's in a realm of veiled gazelles that we are. And, imagine yourself at an oasis out in the desert, and imagine the sand blowing by in the various whirlwinds. And imagine yourself as being an experienced enough traveler, guided, blessed, and protected by the One Most High, that you know your business apart from the business of the jinn, the genies, who also appear in the form of whirlwinds in the desert. But imagine you see the blowing sand blowing into certain suggestive shapes, and imagine that you hear the sound of the sand as it blows, and just a step into the liminal world, into the imaginal world, and then you begin to hear the voices of the sands as the wind blows them across the desert. And sometimes they take strange shapes, sometimes gazelles. And you might say, oh, whirling sand grains, I've been reading Ibn Arabi, and I've been thinking about what is a veiled gazelle. And I see some of these sand-blown shapes in the shapes of gazelles. Oh, are you veiled gazelles? Are you veiled gazelles? And the veiled gazelles answer in a veiled way. They say, with the voice of wind-blown sand, they say, we are thoughts. We are thoughts. We are thoughts. So, this is Ibn Arabi gives us a suggestion. We can listen to our thoughts, you see. We can become aware of our thoughts in a certain way so that they can present themselves to us in a fuller form. Our terms to understand them will be poetic terms, will be naturally, it's a God-given innate human capacity, to compose poetry in organic, symbolic terms. Once the way to do that is accepted by the psyche, and then one realizes one attends to thoughts. We're caught in the grip of thinking, and perhaps always will be in this world, and yet other times we attend to thoughts, and we begin to hear the voices of the thoughts, and then we begin to come to understand them in such a way that it becomes incumbent upon us to begin to describe them as things like veiled gazelles, which we can learn to attend to in a certain way. So this is something that I want to do. And then, in the interest of having a nice, compacted kind of talk, I'm just going to offer just a poem written by myself, and then I will, allow this to take its shape. So this is just a short 14-line poem. I think it's this one that I will read as I find the pages as I turn to them, fortunately, because I've introduced that concept of the qalb, and so here's a poem where some of it's very you can see some of the flavor and some of the atmosphere, some of the taste of what we've looked at tonight a little bit with Ibn Arabi. This poem is called Readable. Readable, it is called. Between two fingers of the hand of the Lord, the qalb is the heart, not just of sentiment, but the very energy of change, container of change. The heart of the believer can contain me, but the earth and the sky cannot. This, by the way, is from a hadith, I believe. But it is a scriptural term. The heart of the believer can contain me, but the earth and the sky cannot. Anything can take on the energy of the ancient word if you allow the sky to collect itself inside your hat, where it shall be as a reflection into the heart of every moment. Even this one and this one, as phantasms dare to dance, challenging oblivion with a candle to the sun. The instant forever of the all at once. Seeing the candle by light of the shade it casts, the poignance of the picture pinned to be put on the wall in the stillness of becoming. unransacked. So there you see the suggestion of some of the themes that we've looked at, some of the themes and things. So I would like then now to just offer these thoughts and allow them to turn over in your mind. And it is my faith and my trust that they will, in their own time and in their own place, inwardly, they will bear much fruit and understanding and insight if that is the will of the way things are. Anyway, so at that point, I must thank you for your heroic listening, and I will say to you, so long for now.